Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here to join us in this very important occasion. Welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Rabbi Capus B'nai, spiritual leader of Beth Shalom, B'nai Zaken, Ethiopian Hebrew congregation. So I want to say to all of you, Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Beth Shalom, B'nai Zaken, Ethiopian Hebrew congregation. We're here today for the memorial service of our beloved Rabbi Robert J. Marx, who was one of my many mentors in the rabbinate, one of the Chicagoland Jewish community, which he served so well. Rabbi Marx was one of the rabbis who wrote letters of support in my effort to become a member of the Chicago Board of Rabbis. Rabbi Marx also introduced me to Rabbi Morris Fishman, a conservative rabbi, who until his passing, the passing of Rabbi Fishman, served as Ab of the Beth Din for many of the individuals who came into the Jewish faith under my teaching. As today is the 17th of Tammuz, a day of fasting in the Jewish community, this day marks 3 weeks of mourning, a mourning period which leads to the 9th of Av. The first holy temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then the Romans breached the walls of Jerusalem in 69 BCE. 3 weeks later, the Romans destroyed the second holy temple on the 9th of Av. So I believe it is appropriate that we have set aside the 17th of Av, of Musilka, the 17th of Tammuz, was set aside to remember our beloved founder of JCUA, a beloved rabbi of our community, Rabbi Robert J. Marx. Once again, welcome to Beth Shalom B'nai Zaken, Ethiopian Hebrew congregation.
On page 5 of your booklet, Psalm 23. Adonai hoi lo eksar, bino deshe yarbit seini, almei menuchot yanachaleni. Nafshi yeshovev yancheni v'magleit tzedek lema'an shemo. Gam ki elech begeit salamavet lo irara ki atai madi, shiftecha mishantecha hema yanachamuni. Ta'aroch lefanai shochan neged sororai deshanta v'shemen roshi kosir levaya. Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni kol yemei chayai. V'shavti b'veit Adonai la'orech yamim. If you care to join in. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in straight paths for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou hast anointed my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We turn now to reflections on the life of Rabbi Marx.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane Ramsey. I was privileged to join the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs in 1979 and to be its executive director for the next 30 years. I welcome Ruth and the Marx family and all of our friends here who are joining us. It is so good to be together. It is not an overstatement for me to say that Rabbi Robert Marx became and remains among the most important persons and influences in my life. He was my rabbi, my mentor and teacher, my co-conspirator, and my very dear friend. Robert Marx was a philosopher, a teacher, and a prophet. He had a twinkle in his eye and a warm smile. He could be tough, too, and had an acerbic, clever, dry wit. He had many tools with which he engaged, moved, and fought. Taking on injustice and privilege at every level was at the core of Robert Marx's being. His framing and astute understanding of the interstitiality of the Jewish people provided the philosophic foundation for JCUA and for the challenge for each of us as Jews. Marx taught that as an interstitial people, we are the people in between the parts of society, neither the most powerful nor the powerless. We must choose our alignments. JCUA was a big idea to act, to fulfill this concept. Marx created this vibrant organization, providing the pathways through which he and we may collectively act for a just city and a just world. Its vision is grounded in prophetic Jewish values and methods that reflected Marx's insights and instincts to courageously, wisely, and humbly take on the most critical civil and human rights challenges facing us then and facing us now. When Rabbi Marx founded JCUA in 1964, it was the first ever local Jewish social justice organization in the country. Truly, he wanted a JCUA in every city, often imploring that we seek ways to achieve this. We were not about empire building, but he planted the seeds that encouraged others in their own communities. Marx's vision and actions catalyzed a national Jewish social justice movement. The mission Marx boldly laid out for JCUA is as relevant today as it was then: to combat racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of bigotry, to eradicate poverty and inequities, to support the empowerment of oppressed communities, to build effective coalitions in pursuit of justice, and to educate and engage our Jewish communities in the work. His vision for how JCUA would go about these tasks called upon us to respond to the requests of grassroots community organizations in Chicago's most oppressed communities, and to act with them on the issues they identified as most pressing. In JCUA's early years, this translated into working predominantly on Chicago's South and West sides with the Black and Latinx organizations, battling discrimination and segregation in housing and schools, and taking on Chicago's oppressive democratic political machine. Marx worked with Dr. King and the Campaign to End the Slums, with the West Side Federation, with Rev Jackson and Operation Breadbasket, and with the Contract Buyers League. It was the latter, the Contract Buyers League, that Marx first faced fierce opposition from persons from within our own Jewish community. They were contract sellers profiting from the exploitive practices of selling their homes on contract to black families unable to obtain conventional mortgages due to the racist policies of redlining. As fiercely as his opposition, Marx, unbending, provided courageous leadership and galvanized crucial support for the families who were the victims of the contract sales. With clarity in choosing his allies, Marx was propelled into often painful, contentious, even hazardous positions. Unrelenting, Marx marched with Dr. King in Marquette Park in the face of an angry, white, stone-throwing mob. He marched with the resident-led coalition to protect public housing, calling out the Chicago Housing Authority for its plan for transformation that resulted in the displacement of tens of thousands of predominantly black, very low-income families. With Unite Here, Marx stood against the egregious mistreatment of hotel workers, demanding a fair contract and safe conditions. In Postville, Iowa, Marx helped lead when JCUA, with our Minneapolis sister organization, Jewish Community Action, brought 1,500 Jews from Chicago and Minneapolis to protest both the exploitation of undocumented workers by the agri-processors' kosher meatpacking plant and their deportation following a raid by ICE. Rabbi Marx, over the past few years, though physically limited due to health issues, remained engaged, reading voraciously, writing op-eds, publishing his book, holding court, engaging, questioning, and challenging us. This did not abate over the past year. During COVID, I loved getting his calls, seeking to talk over what was happening in the country. His analytical perspective always brought clarity and new ways to understand what was confronting us and how we could respond. Marx, of course, was greatly disturbed, even depressed, with the rise of white supremacy and signs of growing fascism. He was more hopeful with Biden's election, even hopeful that the insurrection would expose the racist forces in America. Fighting for people's lives and human rights was a primary concern, and Rabbi Marx did not ever wear rose-colored glasses. On a personal note, for the past 40 years on this very day, June 27th, I knew I'd hear from Rabbi Marx, who would call to wish me a happy birthday. It would be a quick call, catching up on family and politics. I imagine he had a long list each day of calls, thoughtful recognitions to say he cared. Today, this remembrance of him, I'll take it for his call. There's a hole in my heart. I want to hold on to his voice, his laughter, his kindnesses, his wicked humor, his smile. He gave us 93 years. He'll give us 93 more as we bring him to each struggle, each march, each action for justice. We will continue to carry him with us, hearing his voice, his wise guidance, his questioning, dialectic engagement, vision, and fierce focus for justice and good. Thank you, Robert. We love you and miss you dearly.
Hello, I am Nikki Willstein. I was the founding executive director of the Polk Brothers Foundation, and as you will hear, I have a long history with the JCUA as a intern staff member, board president, and a long time love with Rabbi Marx. I first met Robert Marx in the fall of 1969. I was 22, had just gotten married, and arrived at the JCUA to work for 3 months as an intern from Antioch College. The JCUA was 5 years old and deeply involved with the Contract Buyers League in Lawndale. Before my internship could begin, I had to get permission from my father to work at the JCUA. He was a federal judge and was hearing the Southside Contract Buyers League case. The folks at the JCUA thought that my working there might present him with a conflict of interest. He wrote that since I was an adult and married, he did not feel that my being at the JCUA would be a problem. After I graduated from Antioch in 1970, I was offered the position of administrator, which I gratefully accepted, and Fred and I moved back to Chicago. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the JCUA was particularly involved in Lawndale, South Shore, and Kenwood, Oakland. The first two communities had, until recently, had large Jewish populations. As Jews left, their institutions remained, sore thumbs for the new residents and a reminder of the rapid exodus of the Jews. Rabbi Marx believed that we had a duty to help transition some of those buildings to organizations that would be led by and work with the African Americans who were moving into Lawndale and South Shore. And in what would be a hallmark of the JCUA's early years, staff were assigned to groups in Lawndale and South Shore with their primary allegiance to be to those organizations. Rabbi Marx said that if the Lawndale People's Planning and Action Conference were to picket the JCUA offices, he would expect Luke Reinberg to be on the picket line. Happily, that never happened, but we all knew where Lou and other JCUA staff would be if it did. Rabbi Marx's unwavering support of the Contract Buyers League did not win him a lot of friends with the more conservative parts of the Jewish community. Because many of the contract sellers were Jewish, and Robert was not afraid to say so, he was ultimately forced out of his day job as head of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in Chicago. Though he was in New York for several years, his connection with the JCUA was not severed. We were fortunate to have a number of true heroes, people like Alan Altheimer, Howard Landau, Herb Hyman, and Bud Lifton, who were very much a part of the larger Jewish community, but also staunch supporters of Rabbi Marx and the JCUA. I can attest to the fact that cash flow was often a real problem in the early 1970s. While we came close, we never missed a payroll or a rent payment, as Rabbi Marx and others continued to help us raise funds to keep the lights on. Those were the years that I knew Rabbi Marx best, but I'd like to share a few thoughts about when he returned to Chicago as a congregational rabbi, work that he loved. Once again, he didn't leave the JCUA behind. He was very much part of our leadership and worked with executive directors, including Milt Cohen and Jane. An interesting thing happened as the nonprofit world began working across the city in issue-oriented coalitions. It wasn't Robert's model, and it sometimes annoyed him, but he accepted it. He spoke at gatherings of groups like the Coalition to Protect Public Housing and supported JCUA's leadership and work against John Burge and police torture wherever it occurred. In recent years, Fred and I visited Robert and Ruth in Saugatuck. Because of COVID, we didn't go last year and missed that very much. In January, I wrote to him, as I often did around Martin Luther King Day. This year, we also had the excitement of the inauguration of Joe Biden, so things were looking up. His reply to me was pure Robert, so I'm going to share a little of it. Let me explain that many, many years ago in a meeting, Rabbi Marx looked at me to say something, drew a total blank, and called me, "What's your name?" Everyone laughed, and it's been part of our banter ever since. Dearest, what's your name? I've been thinking of you too, and I'm glad that you and Fred are in Michigan and safe. Ruth and I, too, are in Michigan and safe, though we are more than a little lonely and bored. We spend much time reading and watching elderly movies. I mean it when I say I think of you often. Weren't those glorious days we spent together? And today, I had not anticipated this feeling, but I just told Ruth, I feel as if I had just been purged. I wish you were closer, Nikki. My love to you and Fred, Robert. As I am sure you can imagine, this is a note I will treasure always, just as I treasure my 50-plus year friendship with Rabbi Marx and relationship with the JCUA. I was so lucky to have found them when I was young, and many of my beliefs and ethical constructs were still forming. My parents gave me an excellent start, but I credit my time at the JCUA with leading to the work I was able to do at Polk Brothers Foundation, supporting organizations all over Chicago in their work to make our city a more just and humane place for all its residents. I want to thank Jane Ramsey for inviting me to speak today, to thank all of you for being here and sharing our love for Robert Marx. He was a giant in my life, and I shall always miss him, his fabulous laugh, his brilliant words, wise counsel, and kind humor. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Judy Levy, the Executive Director of JCUA. I feel emotional and inspired to be with all of you here today. From the moment I joined the staff of JCUA in 2009, I knew that Rabbi Marx was a beloved leader. The historic significance of his actions to fight discrimination and racism in the 1960s cannot be overstated. And he advanced that work, along with the bold work of community building throughout his entire life. He was a visionary, and I am profoundly grateful to have known him. Through many staff field trip adventures and several personal visits to Saugatuck, I had the good fortune to enjoy Rabbi and Ruth's wholehearted hospitality. On staff trips, with excitement and anticipation, we would arrive and settle in for the afternoon. The JCUA staff members would sit riveted while Rabbi Marx held court, recounting stories and sharing his perspective, always with warmth and good humor, and often with clever quips meant to test us to make sure we were listening. In our time together, he was extraordinarily tuned in to the here and now. He was a compassionate listener. Instead of answers, he offered new ways to view our challenges. He was firmly oriented toward the future and was proud to have given rise to generations of young people, guiding them in finding meaning and purpose in our collective work. He knew that JCUA's relevance depended on its capacity to work for justice in every generation. His spirited encouragement was a source of strength for me as I sought to understand JCUA's unique history, impact, and potential. I have also learned so much from many of you here today. And I know that you extended your generosity of spirit towards me in part as a way of honoring him. What a moving testament to how special he was. In my last couple of trips to Saugatuck, I brought my husband Sandy along, and because he and Rabbi Marx shared a love of philosophy, they would end up in lengthy esoteric discussions about Aeschylus or Proust. I would of course get annoyed that Sandy was laying claim to my precious minutes, and Rabbi Marx would sense my irritation. We certainly kept him on his toes. He was a masterful communicator, and every trip was memorable. My leadership of JCUA has been enriched by Rabbi Marx's mentorship and astute understanding of our sacred work in a broken and beautiful world. He had a grounding influence on me that I carry with me today. It is not unusual for JCUA leaders and staff, most of whom never met Rabbi Marx, to ask, what would Rabbi Marx do in this situation? They sense that the process of predicting the answer will be illuminating. I have no doubt that his memory will endure for generations to come. Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may the memory of the righteous be a blessing.
God bless you to the family of Rabbi Robert Marx and to our dear sister, Ms. Ramsey, to the rabbi of this house, Rabbi Capers, Reverend Janet Jackson, Congressman Davis, and our brother Congressman who is here with us. We just want to thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to share with you a few words about Rabbi Robert Marx. First, I would like to say that rabbis of love and faith and justice never die. They live on through their students. We, you and I, can always commemorate someone who stood against wrong. Rabbi Robert Marx had an extraordinary boldness, fearless activism, passionate integrity, and an abounding faith for justice. This faith for justice allowed Rabbi Marx to stand up and march with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This faith allowed him to march in Selma for voting rights. This faith allowed him to protest segregated housing policies on the south and west side of Chicago. This faith allowed him to stand in Marquette Park. This faith allowed him to march even with some wicked white folks that wanted to throw rocks and bricks at him and Dr. King. He kept on marching. This faith to stand and to write a message of why free persons must stand up as agents of peace. Years ago, as I was a younger man, I had the opportunity of driving Rabbi Marx home after a press conference in Highland Park. I thought to myself that Rabbi didn't have to be there speaking out against racial profiling. He didn't have to be there speaking out against segregated housing. He didn't have to be there continuously standing and marching for the Voting Rights Act in Selma. He didn't have to be there as he organized the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. But he was there. And I want to say that because he was there with preachers like Reverend Shelvin Hall, John Porter, Reverend Ed Riddick, and others that I remember, he can say, just like many others that have marched and have stood the test, others like Reverend Jesse Jackson, and he can say that when the hungry cried out for something to eat, he could say that he was there. When the thirsty cried out for something to drink, he was there to give them drink. When the stranger needed to be taken in, he was there. When the naked needed to be clothed, he was there. And when somebody needed someone to stand in the door in Marquette Park and on the west side with the West Side Organization and stand and not give in when they wanted to put people out. He was there. And therefore, the Lord will say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have done a good job." We will never forget that Rabbi Marx was there. God bless you.
Buenas tardes. Shalom, que la paz de Dios sea con todos ustedes. My name is Jorge Morales, and I am a member of the First Congregational Church in Elmhurst and recent retired Illinois Conference minister in the United Church of Christ. And I met Rabbi Robert J. Marx through my sister, Jane Ramsey, when I was a community activist and before becoming a church bureaucrat. I'm delighted to be here. I greatly admire the Rabbi Marx. I think he was a great visionary. He was invested in the spirit and the struggle of oppressed people. And I think that when he created the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, he was basically setting the foundation for some of the great benefits that many of our communities reaped years later. And I can think of the 20 years later in the 80s when we Latinos were engaged in seeking political representation, combating arson for profit, wanted to develop community and leadership. Rabbi Marx and JCUA were there supporting us. And he was very much a bridge for unification and reconciliation and diversity, bringing people together of various traditions and backgrounds, no distinction. In fact, the different was in his heart. And he wanted those that distinguished themselves and were at the margins to be part of the cause and the issues that he was engaged in. As a visionary, he was invested in the art of seeing what was invisible to others. And I think what was invisible to others, but that he could see, was that he realized the importance of local community leadership and investing in new leadership. He was able to see the significance and importance of power in local community and the building of institutions and infrastructure for depressed, disenfranchised communities. He saw the inherited good of every person. And he realized that there was a preferred future, God's preferred future for the poor and the oppressed. I think that as a Jewish man, he had a real insight into what the oppressor was like, the oppressor's cruelty and injustice, and at the same time had a vision of an insight into the hope and aspiration of the oppressed. And he cast his lot with the oppressed. And he set the foundation. I think he set the foundation for the benefits that we reaped and that some of us were engaged in some years later. He had a social conscience and awareness. I think he walked the line between oppressed people, the oppressor and oppressed people, and could see both sides and cast his lot with the most vulnerable for the sake of empowerment and liberation. I think in that sense he was a distinguished author. And as a distinguished author in a society that defined itself in black and white, he certainly worked to bridge differences, to reduce conflict. And it was important to the Chuy Garcias and the Jorge Morales and the other Latinos that were aspiring to seek ways for our community to be developed and improve this human condition. Because many times we saw ourselves as the other in a black and white community seeking to define ourselves, and sometimes even seeing ourselves also as agents that could bridge some differences for the sake of humanity and a better world for all. He was a great ally. I remember that during and after the city council wars, he was there coaching and leading, doing the Harold Washington campaign, doing the threat of the Nazis marching in Skokie. He brought us together. And he not only brought us together, but he insisted that every voice, that there was true diversity, that those most marginalized would be heard and would feel as an integral part of what needed to happen and to take place. He was a vital leader in the city and in the state and in the nation at a very significant and important time. And we are grateful to his beloved Ruth and his family for sharing Rabbi Marx with us. And we pray that you may be comforted and strengthened in the knowledge that he reigns with God and the saints. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sister Patricia Crowley, and I'm the daughter of Pat and Patty Crowley, who were friends of Ruth and Bob. And I'm a believer and promoter of the justice values that Rabbi Marx so lived. This is a copy of my mother's funeral program. And in it reads, the first reading from Isaiah 58, 2-8. Rabbi Robert Marx, a longtime friend and founding member of the Jewish Catholic dialogue. In the words of that ancient prophet, Bob's spirit today proclaims, this rather is the fasting that I wish, releasing those bound unjustly, untying the tongs of the yoke, setting free the oppressed, breaking every yoke, sharing your bread with those who are hungry, sheltering those who are homeless, clothing those who are naked when you see them, and not turning your back on your own. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn. That passage echoes Bob's life and the life of my parents. Their lives continue to break forth like the dawn. On December 1st of 2005, the day of my mother's funeral, Bob got stuck, unfortunately, in a snowstorm and called to tell us he could not be there. So my nephew, Dr. Danton Kono, read that passage, and Bob would have been proud of that reading. Clearly, Bob was a sterling human being, known by so many for his expansive justice work through his amazing life. My parents were only two among many social justice leaders, promoters in our city. Along with Jerry Stone and Father John Polakowski and my parents, Bob launched a wonderful group of people that's sometimes known as the Jewish Catholic Dialogue Group and sometimes known as the Catholic Jewish Dialogue Group, depending on who's talking. That group endured for many years, even as the founders left this earthly life, until the pandemic hit. And hopefully some of the successors will revive it again as we come together. I feel privileged today to be here on behalf of my parents and behalf of Bob. And I thank Jane for inviting me to join this auspicious group. May we all continue to work for justice, the justice evidenced so clearly in Bob's life and legacy. Thank you. Adelante.
Hello, my brothers and sisters. It is indeed to be a part of this memorial service, memorializing Rabbi Robert J. Marx, a friend of many, 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 many years. And of course, to think of Rabbi Marx is also to call to mind so many notable religious and civic leaders who worked alongside him and the rest of us struggling for freedom and justice and self-determination, certainly here in the city of Chicago, as well as around the country. Rabbi Arnold Wolf comes to mind. Rabbi Shalom comes to mind. And of course, when we really think about the struggle for justice and working together, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, you know, who worked with us, and especially years like 1964, 65, when the JCUA was founded by Robert Marx. And so it was just a wonderful thing. Folk like Al Raby in the city of Chicago, Addie Wyatt, Bill Berry, Harold Washington, all of those wonderful people come to mind. Rabbi Marx, of course, as you all know, was supremely committed to fighting for justice at every echelon of life in the Chicago area. And I remember him so very well. How much do we need the spirit of Rabbi Marx to live on today, especially as we see a kind of a turning back of the clock on our progress for justice and freedom in this nation, and particularly dealing with the scourge of violence in the city of Chicago and so many other social ills. I'm honored to be a part of this memorial service and want to thank Jane Ramsey and her staff for putting this together. You know, the work, this is something that Rabbi Marx and I would say. The work remains great and our time is short. We are not called to complete this great work, yet we are not free to desist from trying. And it is in this spirit that we remember him and all those who worked along beside him. Monsignor Egan, for instance, and others in their Christian community, Jewish community, the Muslim community, all of us together. So God bless you. Thank you for putting this together. It is absolutely an awesome experience. And thanks for making me a part of it. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Martin Baumgartel and I am joining you from Berlin, Germany. From 1985 to 1986, I was the very first German intern to work with JCUA under the auspices of Action Reconciliation Service for Peace. Volunteering with JCUA was my alternative service to the military draft. I am a conscientious objector. I want to share with you an experience I had the 4th of September in 1985. I found myself at a meeting at the Episcopal Diocese at East Huron Street. You may ask, how come? Rabbi Marx couldn't attend the meeting and asked Jane Ramsey to represent him. And at JCUA's office, something popped up that day that couldn't be delayed by any means. So Jane gave me $5 for a cab, some instructions, and asked me to represent her. Before I realized what was going on, I was, together with Episcopal and other clergymen, planning an interfaith service addressing the apartheid in South Africa. Me, a German intern representing Jane Ramsey, representing Rabbi Marx. Being the Jewish part in that meeting, it was me who was asked if the proceedings we found for the service were all right with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I was thinking by myself, only in America. Well, despite the obstacles, everything worked out fine, and the following Sunday we could celebrate our opposition to apartheid in South Africa with this interfaith service. I met Rabbi Marx in person every few weeks at the JCUA board meetings. After a board meeting with a heated discussion about anti-Semitism in America, he wanted to know what was in my head during such discussions. So we exchanged our thoughts and opinions, and I wrote a short memo for him and Lou Kreinberg, who was my supervisor. I always admired Robert Marx for his intellect and his thoughtful essays. But Robert Marx was far more than a scholar and a rabbi. He was an activist too. His analysis of the interstitiality of the Jewish people became a driving force to pursue justice, and to empower the marginalized. This is just great and wonderful, and I am sure that what he started will continue. I will remember Rabbi Robert Marx as a very kind man with a firm attitude, with an outspoken sense for justice, and a prophetic vision for a better world. Thank you for including me.
Good afternoon. My name is Vic Rosenthal. I'm the former director of Jewish Community Action in Minnesota, and I'm very happy to be with you today. Thanks to Jane Ramsey and the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs for this opportunity to speak about Rabbi Robert Marx. In February of 2019, I had an opportunity to visit with Rabbi Marx at his home in Michigan. Thanks to Jane, of course, for setting it up. This was an opportunity to revisit the origins of Jewish Council on Urban Affairs and how it influenced the formation of Jewish Community Action in Minnesota. As he had always been, Rabbi Marx patiently answered all of my questions about why starting JCUA was so important in the 1960s and why this work nearly 60 years later is still so important. He shared stories about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Poor People's Campaign and why Jewish engagement in this work was so necessary. Rabbi Marx was willing to share stories about his life and why social justice was so important to him. It was Rabbi Marx's vision and teaching that made it so clear that forming local Jewish social justice organizations was so important. Until meeting Rabbi Marx, I never even heard the word interstitial. But for Rabbi Marx, it was more than just a concept. It was the idea that Jewish people had this unusual place in society. Jews were people who had been oppressed by white supremacy, but also had privileges by passing as white people. One of the most important lessons I learned from Rabbi Marx was the idea of taking risks and challenging the Jewish community to do more. It was a lesson that I brought with me during my many years of Jewish community action. And when JCA was getting off the ground, Rabbi Marx and Jane came to Minnesota and patiently answered all of our questions and provided guidance as we started. Rabbi Marx was both gracious and supportive. He was a mentor and willing to challenge us to push JCA to become the organization and coalition builder that he had successfully pursued for the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. In 2008, when JCUA and JCA organized a march and service in Postville, Iowa, to protest violations of worker justice and immigrant justice, Rabbi Marx, despite his advanced age, was there. Once again, he spoke with his soft but powerful voice of the obligation for Jewish community to be allies to immigrants and workers. And when we marched from the church to the plant, he was with us. For him, social justice was an essential part of Judaism, and where else would he be but in Postville? Now, as I work with a colleague on a book about Jewish community action and its history of organizing work, I will always know the origins of this local organizing work. I will remember the guidance, teaching, and prophetic vision of Rabbi Marx. And when we complete the book, there will certainly be a dedication and tribute to Rabbi Robert Marx for his leadership. Thank you, Rabbi Marx, for all that you taught me and so many of us. We owe you a tremendous amount of gratitude. I know that the memory of you will be a blessing. Thank you.
So as you see in your program, we originally had thought that Reverend Jackson was going to pre-record a message, but even better, we have the honor of having him with us right now. Reverend Jackson.
Good afternoon. Take special delight being with you today, Rabbi, members of the program, beloved Jane. Thank you for your presence today and all that you mean to us. I was not in the city last week and I didn't get the notice in time, so I have an event for the children at the border, further northwest, and then another one trying to get Indian respirators and the like to India. So, but I had to alter my schedule because Rabbi altered his schedule. He meant so much to me and to all of us. Thank him for his blessing of us. We moved into KM Temple. He was there. I wish that we would do something. You know, he always broke traditions. I wish that you would step on your hand, put your hand together for Rabbi Marx, on your feet. Put your hands together. Let me hear you. Put your hands together. Put your hands together. Put your hands together. Mr. My thanks to all of you who are here today, to you, Congressman Davis, in a very special way, to you, Chewy. It's a very different kind of guy we're talking about today. If Harold Washington were here, he would be here today. And because we are also indebted to Rabbi Marx as a leader. He heard the sound of the authentic. There's a vision about Rabbi Marx. Rabbi Marx was with Dr. King in Selma, Alabama, would have been in Chicago. Many with Dr. King in Selma would not have been in Chicago. He was consistent in that sense. He had the sense of pathos, thing that Rabbi Heschel had, a sense of intimate participation with people. He shared so deeply. Man of faith, not empty gyrations, but faith. Faith, salvation is involved in faith. People are under attack. It is the things hoped for, things unseen, evidence unseen. Each time we had a major confrontation, it was always there. Faith can see around the corner without getting that curve, without getting to the corner. Faith, the belief that there's a rightness in the living God. Right was might. He followed in the best tradition. Feed the hungry and clothe the naked and set the captive free. March without the king was not an easy thing. People who live in this neighborhood now, black and brown, because Rabbi Marx marched here. We couldn't live this far west. He marched here before people were able to build a house here. Thank him for that part of his tradition. He advised and counseled me. I was in trouble with y'all and everybody else. He was there with me all the way. I thank Rabbi Marx for his living, his legacy. I cannot speak of him in past tense. He is president right now. He is a frame of reference. You will make a certain move, Rabbi Marx, what he said about it. Because we had not seen him, many of us had not seen him in a long time since he retired up on the side of the lake. But we had always had him in our conscience, in our mind. He was always there. I want to thank the family for sharing him with us in such a way. We moved to the open housing march in Chicago. He was here. Many of those who were out King and Selma that were with him in Chicago came too close to home. Afraid of Mayor Daley. Rabbi respected Daley, but he did not bow to him. A principled sense of the man. When he spoke, people listened because he had something to say. A man of action, not just words. Put his body on the line, his living sacrifice. And we need him today as never before. Something about him that was kind of magic. In this Heschel tradition business, when he spoke, people listened because they heard in him this special something. And he cut it as he saw it. He made us better, never better, better, never better. He always showed us off. I want to say to you today, my friends, members of the family, you have an obligation to keep his dream alive. You're in the tradition. To honor him is to honor the best in ourselves. He represents the best in the human family. Whether it's talking about Israel or talking about Mississippi, he's always there, fighting for justice, fighting for the right. I want to express my thanks to him because when I was sick with the Parkinson's, which affects your speech and affects your movement, he was there, offering prayer, hopping along, 94 years old. Not long ago, we were meeting together again. So I want to express my thanks to all of you who are here today. I'm glad that you are here today. We have worked through, we have monuments put in his name. We have scholarships put in his name. We need him alive today. He says, in a real sense, kind of like Job, suffering as the will of God. Though you slay me, yet will I trust you. His faith was that kind of faith. Though you slay me, yet will I trust you. The Lord was his shepherd. He believed that. Make him lie down beside still waters in hot ghettos. His faith. Let me say about people who call by my name. He was a healer. Call by, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then they'll help me from heaven. Heal the land. He had the faith. He kept the faith, had the power. Let's remember him for as long as we shall live. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon y muy buenas tardes to all. I am Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia, and I am both humbled and honored to be providing my testimonial on the life and significance of Rabbi Robert Marx to my community, and of course my larger family of warriors for justice across this country and the world. Rabbi Funye Capers, backwards, and Rabbi Elder. I first met Rabbi Marx in 1977-78 through the friendship of Jane Ramsey, as we were laying out strategies on defending the rights of immigrants and fighting, 1977-78, for immigration reform. And in the, sound familiar? And in that quest, we of course were looking for allies and friends, and we found them. They were in Chicago at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, and they were unbending in their understanding, their empathy, and their belief and commitment to ensuring those rights for the struggling immigrant community. Certainly the Jewish experience in America and across the world in the diaspora made them people with experience in that field. And that was the beginning of a long and lasting relationship to this day. That relationship was further cemented in the fact that my boss at the Legal Assistance Foundation, Kalman Resnick, was also a very progressive activist Jew. And of course, that relationship continues to this day. In the Pilsen community, where a lot of our activism, and it's a cradle of much progressive, Latino progressive activism that has expanded to the Little Village community, my neighborhood of now 53 years, and across the Southwest Side. And of course, this synagogue is a testament to that activism and a partner, not just a testament, because we speak in the present and we speak in the future in our struggle for justice. But the relationship helped create entities and organisms for continuing advancement and struggle. The creation of the Pilsen Housing Business Alliance is a testament to that. It was led by the late Professor Arturo Vasquez and of course Rudy Lozano, who helped bring that about. Its purpose was to ensure the continuation of the Pilsen community for immigrant and working class residents, especially for the Mexican Americans and immigrants who were coming there. Our involvement in that effort included preventing the coming of the 1992 World's Fair to Chicago that would have leveled much of Pilsen for a parking lot. That history and trajectory, of course, continued in the fight to protect Pilsen against forces that were encroaching upon it that would cause displacement and gentrification. Things like the expansion of the University of Illinois' South Campus expansion in 1997 and 98. And that fight, of course, continues today. But one of the entities that came from that fight was the creation of the Pilsen Alliance, an organization that I helped co-found and that remains present in that community and certainly leading the fight against gentrification and displacement. I was extremely honored in 2012 for the reasons that the prior testimonial providers have already shared with you in receiving, and I know that there are others in the room who have received the Rabbi Marx Social Justice Award. It was one of the highest honors ever bestowed on me, and I want you to know that it continues to be an honor that is a living honor, at the same time, a living challenge. As we struggle in Washington, D.C., not only to preserve democracy against white supremacy and other forces that are rooted in undemocratic rule and an undemocratic vision of our country, the life and the values of Rabbi Marx are instilled in me, and it is a guiding force in everything that I do, in votes that I take on social justice issues, and yes, even foreign policy issues. As you know, he was quite outspoken in that regard as well. But I also want you to know that my relationship to Robert Marx goes back to my days in high school here on the Southwest Side at St. Rita High School, where I first learned of the Nazi Party and it's being rooted and headquartered at that time here in Marquette Park. When I learned about the civil rights struggle of the 1960s and going back to the 1950s, I learned that Robert Marx was one of those allies of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, and their actions, their courageous actions in Marquette Park. And that has been an inspiration to me about what it means to be a warrior for justice in our times and throughout. And I want you to know that I personally am grateful to Rabbi Marx for his work in bringing about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why 1965, Reverend Jakes? Because it's the year that I arrived in the Pilsen community, okay? If it hadn't been for the Voting Rights Act, I might not be in Congress today. I might not have been a member of the Chicago City Council during the 80s when we overcame the challenge of racism and won the fight in council wars, okay? Rabbi Marx is to be thanked for that. It's also interesting that because of the Voting Rights Act, it enabled Harold Washington in his brief tenure in Congress. Danny Davis, my colleague from the West and Southwest side as well, to amend the Voting Rights Act so that we could win the fight, let democracy prevail in Chicago, and give Harold Washington a majority, David Orr, in Chicago City Council in 1986. As I said in my eulogy to Harold Washington, in 1986, we became 26 with Harold Washington's tie-breaking vote. So I just wanted to pay that, my respects for him. Finally, I know my 4 minutes are up. I want you to know that as we celebrate all of Rabbi Marx's work as a champion of civil rights, and of course with respect to the Voting Rights Act that we're struggling to defend at this point in time in the history of our democracy, that Rabbi Marx was also a defender of immigrants and immigrants' rights, an ally of the Latino community and its struggle for political empowerment, as Brother Morales has attested, and a stalwart for affordable housing. If he were here today, I have no doubt that he would be telling us to work hard for the American Jobs Act and the American Families Act to go as big and bold as possible to save the planet, to reconstruct our democracy, and to put an end to structural racism and inequities that have taught us so much about what's wrong with our society. We can do better, and thank God that we had Rabbi Marx as one of our lights to guide us. Thank you.
I'm Kim Bobo. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. I had the honor of working closely with Rabbi Marx for almost 20 years on economic justice issues. Interfaith lessons from Rabbi Marx. Rabbi Marx is loved in the broad interfaith world. He was a founder of Arise Chicago and then Interfaith Worker Justice, which mobilized and engaged faith leaders across religious traditions to work with labor and support low-wage workers. He served as the second board president for Interfaith Worker Justice during its formative stages. Rabbi Marx showed us how to work together for the beloved community. I'd like to share 4 quick interfaith lessons I learned from Rabbi Marx. Lesson 1, build close friendships across faith and race lines. Rabbi Marx, Monsignor Jack Egan, Methodist Bishop Jess DeWitt were not only co-founders of Chicago Interfaith and IWJ, they were dear friends. They had meals together. They joked with one another. They made fun of one another. They had deep relationships. Our close relationships must be across faith and race lines. Lesson 2, show up regularly. Rabbi Marx made showing up for interfaith justice activities a priority. I'm sure he was busy. All clergy are. But if you ask him to do something, he showed up. Not just for the seemingly important events, but for the ragtag rallies. Like the prophet Isaiah, who said, "Here am I, send me." He went to Milwaukee and Detroit to help start interfaith groups. He prayed on the street in front of Newlywed Foods. He went to Las Vegas to meet with an unscrupulous casino owner. When invited, he showed up. Lesson 3, speak inclusively. Rabbi Marx was an amazing preacher and teacher, including everyone. You could count on him to take a Talmudic story and make it helpful to Christians and Muslims. He intentionally drew out the universal principles from his tradition so that we all felt included. His speaking sought to include, not divide. And lesson 4, support young leaders. Rabbi Marx invested in young people. He met with seminarians and rabbinic students. He encouraged my young staff. He quizzed my sons. He truly wanted to get to know young people. He was curious and interested and supported them, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. Rabbi Marx was an interfaith leader. He showed us how by building close relationships across faith lines, showing up regularly, speaking inclusively, and supporting young leaders. May we all learn from and follow his lead.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings. Shalom. Ashe. Ruth, and to the Marx family, it's an extraordinary honor to be here. To Jane and to Rabbi Fanay, it always feels home to be in our neighborhood synagogue here at Beth Shalom. And to those who had anything to do with the lineup today, I will forgive you. I told the Reverend, it's just unfair to follow a Reverend at any time, especially on a Sunday morning. You know, homiletics is something they study. I didn't even know what that word meant until I had to go to theological school. They study this art, and of course, but all the words spoken before me, I'm just moved and humbled and very grateful to be here. There's a piece of paper with 2 phrases on it. It comes from a teaching of a rabbi by the name of Bunim, a great Polish Hasidic master of the turn of the 19th century. Rabbi Bunim is credited with saying the following: everyone must have 2 pockets with a note in each so that he or she can reach into one or the other depending on the need. When feeling lowly and depressed, discouraged, one should reach into the right pocket and there find the words, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. The world was created for me. And when feeling high and mighty, one should reach into the left pocket and find the words, Va'onachai afar va'afar. Excuse the Hebrew. I am but dust and ashes. These were the words that Rabbi Marx shared with me when I was let go from the embargo from the MacArthur Foundation to announce to the world that I had been selected to be one of their MacArthur Fellows. I, of course, had a list of people that I would call before they would find out from the media, and the 5 on the top of my list included my mother, of course, and Rabbi Marx. And he smiled. I heard and felt his smile over the phone, and then he shared those words. And it's one of a couple of moments I'd like to share with you. The second was I think, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Council of Urban Affairs. Nikki, you were up on stage. It was amid one of the unfortunate, several horrific bombing assaults on Gaza. That year, 1,432 civilians died, most of them children. I was asked to share some words, but more importantly, if you remember, with Reverend Calvin Morris, we're sitting at the same table with Rabbi Marx, unplanned. He asked both of us to help him up to share words that day. On his right, there was Reverend Calvin Morris, and on his left, standing with him, there I was. And at a certain point in his comments, he addressed an uncomfortable topic, surely in a room full of a diverse group of supporters that have been with JCUA for many years, and a diverse group of Jewish community members who, of course, came from across the political spectrum on issues related to Israel-Palestine. Rabbi Marx knew that on his left, helping him stand at the podium, was the son of a Palestinian refugee who in May of 1948 was among 750,000 Palestinians who fled her village, Ein Kerem, and landed among the first Palestinian Americans to settle on the south side of Chicago. And that on my father's side, a long-standing generational heir of a family deeply rooted in the city of Jerusalem going back hundreds of years. And addressing the crowd at one point, he spoke very briefly but powerfully about what was happening in Gaza and what was happening to Palestinians, and spoke in a way that I could tell certainly made people feel uncomfortable. So uncomfortable to the point that I think some of the organizers at JCUA were a little worried and said, "Do you think he was off?" And I think I shared with you, Judy, and among the others, that no, Rabbi Marx was absolutely on message. Because in both cases, the morning that I called him and that day I stood with the podium, Rabbi Marx did what he always does so beautifully, which is teach us to, and certainly taught me, to unapologetically speak from the Jewish tradition, speak with moral authority, to call out and to call up from within the tradition. A powerful lesson for all of us within any tradition. Certainly for me as a Muslim Palestinian organizer, activist, aspiring scholar who saw in Rabbi Marx many of the things I've always aspired to be. And as a person who thought deeply about these types of issues, Rabbi Marx knew that he would lead by example, and that unlike many of his students, I would not be as pretentious to say that he was a formal mentor. But from a distance, Rabbi Marx was so much to me. Personally, he was an extraordinary source of joy, of consistent humility, of love, of affection. He reminded me that the words that are inscribed on the memorial that we helped to build as the first and only memorial to Martin Luther King, and made the critical decision that on that memorial we would call it the living memorial of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Chicago Freedom Movement, one that I hope many of you will be with us here shortly to go visit, and made the critical decision while he was alive to memorialize Rabbi Marx and to share the words that he wrote on that day, August 5th, 1966, over 50, close to 55 years ago, when this very building was a site for sanctuary for the 700 marchers, and when Marx wrote prophetically about the previous week, about being on the wrong side of the street, and boldly declaring that he would never be on the wrong side of the street again. That was a faith leader that spoke with courage, with conviction, with humility. And I was really affected to hear of his loss. I think the morning, it was a Sunday morning that I received the call from Jane, and the night before was a very sacred night in the Muslim calendar, the 15th of Sha'ban, and it was the day of fasting in the Muslim community, and one that commemorates, I think, appropriately for this moment, the freedom of the children of Israel from the oppression of Pharaoh. The story has it when the Prophet Muhammad found the Jewish community fasting, peace upon him, in Medina, that he asked why were they fasting, and they spoke to him of this story, and he said, this is a sacred story in our tradition, and we will fast. In fact, we'll fast 2 days as well. And so from that day forward, it is also part of the Muslim sacred days. And it was in fact that morning that he had passed away. I was intending to speak to him. I felt something the night before, and I told Ruth that if it had not been so late, I would have called, but comforted to know that he passed away in a state of peace with his family, with loved ones. There's a verse from the Quran on our wall. If you pass by 63rd, you'll see it today. That comes from a chapter in the Quran saying, the chapter of mercy, Surah Rahman. And in it, in the middle of the chapter, are the words, Hal jazal ahsan ilal ahsan. Is there any reward for good other than good? Is there any, the same word also references making things beautiful in the world. Is there any reward for beauty other than beautiful things? And I would like to think that Rabbi Marx lived a life of beauty. He lived a life of sacrifice. He lived a life of commitment. And I'd like to pray that he stays encompassed in that beauty and that his spirit remains with us as an enduring source of inspiration, as an enduring reminder of how to make things beautiful. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Harriet Rosenthal, and I have been asked to speak on behalf of Congregation Hakafah about our beloved founding Rabbi, Robert Marx. I consider it an honor and privilege to be asked to do so. Where to begin? As far back as I can remember, it was his warm, engaging smile and twinkling eyes that most immediately drew a person in. Then the realization that behind all that was a mind always hard at work. He consistently would start with a bit of philosophy, which then would become insight, which then would become woven into Sunday morning adult study and Friday night sermons, which ultimately comprised the holiness that made us Hakafah. I cherish the years I was able to work intimately with Robert, first as our newly formed congregation's Director of Education, and then as President. Worship, study, and social justice shaped the life he lived. His values, his spirituality, and his loving commitment were always an inspiration. He was a spiritual leader to many of us, and through example, led us to grow and examine our own lives in light of his lofty principles. Robert was my friend. I cherished his companionship and presence, whether it was sitting side by side during high holiday services, reacting to ideas that he would constantly bat around, or merely sharing dinner or a cup of coffee. I loved his sense of humor, and even a few of his many corny jokes that he offered with such great enthusiasm. In all this, it was clear when he wanted to talk versus when he had had enough. I knew when I was being led and gently manipulated, and admit to being benefited from every bump along the way. Our congregation was Robert's vision. He came up with the name Hakafa, meaning an encirclement. It was his vision that a synagogue should be built on the principle of a circle that surrounds those in need and encompasses a wide ring of diversity. He saw no requirement for a building or a board of directors, fearing distraction from the congregation's smooth flow of innovative education, good deeds, and holiness. Robert allowed us to share this vision and left us its legacy. As part of that legacy, Robert brought us Bruce Elder, who has so beautifully assumed the mantle. Speaking for my husband Stan and myself, our long relationship with Robert and Ruth never, ever will be forgotten. We think of both of you so very often with deep love and affection. I will miss my many phone calls to Robert, following strict protocol, of course, of never conflicting with Saturday afternoon radio operas. As for Stan, he will miss our long drives to Saugatuck and the ever-bloody chess game awaiting. Thank you, Robert, for your engaging smile, your twinkling eyes, and our ever-wonderful Hakafa. These are etched deeply in all of our hearts.
Good afternoon. I am Ruth Marx. On behalf of my family, I would like to thank all of you here, and out there online. But more, I would like to thank Congregation Beth Shalom B'nai Zaken, Ethiopian Hebrew, and their rabbi, Capers Bunye. I can think of no place better to have a memorial service for Robert Marx than right here. He worked for this community like he worked for communities all over. You have heard from other speakers here of Robert's many accomplishments. He had met with presidents, prime ministers, a king, and even Yasser Arafat. But I need to tell you about the Robert I married. We would have been married 40 years on August 16th. On August 17th, he would have been 94. We decided on August 16th because we knew that as we got older, we would forget stuff, but at least we would know in the middle of August something happened that was important. Robert loved cashmere. Cashmere sweaters, fountain pens, fresh squeezed orange juice, a good steak, dark chocolate candy, coconut cake, chess, the radio, the telephone, the Cubs and the Detroit Tigers, opera and the New York Times. He would do the New York Times Sunday crossword puzzle in ink in record time. But his passion was books. He read constantly. Montaigne, Plato, Hugo, Twain, Steinbeck, Thomas Mann, A.G. Aside from numerous books on philosophy, on history, of social interactions, and of course, Judaica. He had an incredible sense of humor. He loved a good, well-structured joke. A good pun was a delight to him. Anyone in our family who gets off a good pun, it's called a Robert. You have been witness to his courage and ability to organize people, regardless of race or religion. His legacy are those organizations, to right wrongs, to empower the powerless, to give a voice to the voiceless. He went up against the big guys. He graduated high school at 15. He went on to earn bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, ordination, and a PhD from Yale. My son once said, how could someone so smart, so elegant, so eloquent marry a woman with 5 teenagers? Robert's answer was, I cannot be your father. You have one, a good one. I want to be your friend. He became their confidant, their counselor, a sharer of books, a sharer of jokes, and eventually the loving grandfather of 15 grandchildren. The word rabbi means teacher. I want you to think of your favorite teacher, whether it be kindergarten, high school, college. What made them your favorite? It was their passion for what they were teaching and also for the art of teaching. They gave you a gift of knowledge, and they said, here, take it, run with it, use it. Robert was an exemplary teacher. All the knowledge gleaned from books and his life experiences went into his teaching, whether it be Friday night, Sunday morning, or any other class. He gave us a gift. He gave us a piece of his soul. He gave you hope. He gave you the idea to give up the fear of questioning, to seek an answer. He comforted the sick. He counseled the distraught. His favorite question when a young couple or an older couple came to him to marry was most provocative. He said, what is it about this person you don't like? It wasn't a joke. It was a provocative question that needed to be thought about. Above all of his teaching experiences, he loved the bar and bat mitzvah kids. Each of those kids struggling with their Torah portion and the speech that they had to give. He helped them with that learning. But then he told them, if you make a mistake, keep going. Don't give up. One of those bar mitzvah boys sent me a picture about a month ago. And it's an unusual picture. It's a picture not of a smiling rabbi, not of a posed photo. It's a picture of an angry Robert. And he's pointing at the person and he's saying, you are important. Don't give up. I have a request. Take what he taught you. He gave us hope. Robert had a favorite passage from Isaiah. Justice, justice shall ye pursue. First you hear it, justice. Justice, then you do it. You are important. Don't give up. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehkiyanu v'ki'imanu v'higilanu lazman hazeh. Shalom.
I'm going to ask that you all remain standing, if you would. On page 6, we'll find Kadisha Tome, the Mourner's Kaddish. For those of you who are unable to stay standing, please feel free to sit. Following our service here, for those who would like, we're going to be proceeding 1/10 of a mile down the road to the Martin Luther King Living Memorial for a few words from Rami and then a few moments of silence. As this is a fast day, we are not having food as part of this. Yes, it's a Jewish event, but it is fasting. But we have bottles of water for those who need over by the memorial, so we hope you'll be able to make it there with us. Kadisha Tome, then Sarah will lead us in a song, and we'll be going. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, v'yalma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agalav v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevorach le'olam olamei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yit hadar, v'yit aleh, v'yit halal, shemei dekutcha b'richu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran b'yalma v'imru amen. Yehei shlam rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, huya aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. You may be seated. Rabbi, thank you. Judy, thank you. Jane, Sarah, thank you. To all of you, we love you. Thank you all.
Thank you.